The Dream on the Hill: How William Randolph Hearst Envisioned a Royal Palace on a Mountain in California. In the spring of 1919, as the world emerged from the shadow of the Great War, a man stood atop a windswept hillside in the Santa Lucia Mountains of California, gazing out over the vast Pacific Ocean stretching endlessly toward the horizon. This was no ordinary man, and this was no idle daydream. William Randolph Hearst, the most powerful newspaper magnate in America, stood on land that had belonged to his family for generations. And in his mind's eye, he saw not the simple ranch structures that dotted the property, but something magnificent, something that would rival the great palaces of Europe and the grand villas of ancient Rome. Hearst had inherited this spectacular property, which he affectionately called Camp Hill, from his beloved mother, Phoebe Apperson Hearst, who had passed away the previous year. The land encompassed nearly 250,000 acres of pristine California coastline and mountain wilderness, a kingdom in its own right. But William Randolph Hearst was not content with wilderness alone. He had spent his life building an empire of newspapers, accumulating wealth beyond measure, and traveling the world, collecting art and antiquities with the fervor of an obsessed connoisseur. Now, at 56 years old, he wanted to create something permanent, something that would stand as a testament to beauty, culture, and his own remarkable vision. The hilltop where Hearst stood that day rose 1,600 feet above the rolling coastal landscape, a natural throne overlooking his domain. He had camped there as a boy with his father, George Hearst, the mining tycoon and senator, sleeping under canvas and riding horses through the Golden Hills. Those memories were precious to him, and he wanted to preserve them even as he transformed the rustic campground into something extraordinary. In his letters to the architect he would soon hire, Hearst wrote of wanting to build a little something on the hill, a phrase that belied the grandiose nature of what he truly envisioned. This little something would eventually grow into 165 rooms, sprawling across multiple buildings, a complex so vast and ornate that it would take nearly 3 decades to construct and would never truly be finished. Hearst's vision was deeply influenced by his extensive travels throughout Europe and the Mediterranean. He had walked through the ruins of Pompeii and Herculaneum, marveling at the sophistication of Roman architecture and design. He had toured the great cathedrals of Spain, studied the Moorish palaces of Andalusia, and wandered through the Renaissance villas of Italy. Unlike many wealthy Americans of his era who built faithful reproductions of European castles, Hearst wanted something uniquely his own, a harmonious blend of all the beauty he had witnessed in his travels, adapted to the spectacular California landscape. He envisioned terraced gardens cascading down the hillside like those of ancient Rome, fountains splashing in courtyards, and buildings that seemed to grow organically from the mountain itself. The publishing magnate's taste ran toward the theatrical and the opulent. He loved drama, spectacle, and the mixing of different historical periods and styles in ways that academic purists might condemn, but that created undeniable visual impact. He wanted ancient Roman statuary standing guard over Spanish Renaissance facades, Greek temple elements incorporated into Mediterranean courtyards, and Egyptian antiquities displayed alongside Gothic tapestries. This eclecticism reflected both his collector's passion and his showman's instinct. Hearst understood that architecture, like his newspapers, needed to capture attention and fire the imagination. The practical challenges of building such a palace on a remote mountaintop were staggering. The site was accessible only by a long, winding dirt road. There was no electricity, no telephone service, no running water beyond what could be captured from springs and stored in tanks. Every brick, every beam, every piece of marble, every antiquity would have to be transported up that precarious road. Construction materials, workers, and eventually the countless artworks and furnishings that Hearst acquired would all make that arduous journey. But difficulties had never deterred William Randolph Hearst. He had built a newspaper empire by sheer force of will, and he would build his castle the same way. What Hearst envisioned was not merely a home, but a complete world, a retreat where he could escape the pressures of his business empire and entertain the most famous and powerful people of his age. He imagined hosting movie stars and politicians, writers and artists, creating a salon of culture and influence high above the everyday world. The main building, which he would call La Casa Grande, would rise like a cathedral, its twin towers visible for miles, a beacon announcing that something extraordinary existed on that hilltop. Surrounding it would be 3 guest houses, each substantial enough to be a mansion in its own right, arranged to create courtyards and terraces that would serve as outdoor rooms. The newspaper baron wanted his creation to feel timeless, as though it had existed for centuries rather than being newly built. He instructed his architect to design in the Mediterranean Revival style, drawing heavily on ancient Roman principles of symmetry, proportion, and the integration of architecture with landscape. The buildings would be constructed of reinforced concrete, a modern material but faced with materials that evoked antiquity. Warm golden stone, antique tiles salvaged from European buildings. Hand-carved wooden ceilings transported from Spanish monasteries. Every element would be carefully chosen to create an atmosphere of established grandeur. Hearst's vision extended beyond the buildings themselves to encompass the entire hilltop environment. He planned elaborate gardens featuring plants from around the world, arranged in formal patterns that recalled the great gardens of European palaces. He envisioned pools and fountains, statuary and pavilions, pergolas draped with flowering vines, and pathways that would lead visitors on a journey of discovery through carefully composed views. He even planned a zoo where exotic animals would roam in enclosures built into the hillside, adding an element of wonder and surprise to the estate. The dream was all-encompassing, a total work of art that would engage every sense and transport visitors to a realm of beauty and fantasy. In his most ambitious moments, Hearst imagined his hilltop creation becoming a cultural institution that would outlast him, a museum and monument that would inspire future generations. He saw it as a repository for the artistic treasures he had spent decades collecting, a place where the finest examples of human creativity from across the centuries and around the world could be displayed in a setting worthy of their beauty. The castle would be his legacy, the physical manifestation of his dreams and his philosophy that life should be lived on the grandest possible scale. As William Randolph Hearst stood on that hilltop in 1919, looking out over the Pacific and imagining the palace that would rise beneath his feet, he could not have known that his dream would consume much of his fortune and occupy him for the rest of his life. He could not have foreseen that his castle would become one of California's most famous landmarks, attracting millions of visitors who would come to marvel at what one man's vision and determination could create. But he knew, with absolute certainty, that he would build something magnificent on this mountain. The long construction, 1947. Why the castle took nearly 28 years to build and was never fully completed. When William Randolph Hearst summoned architect Julia Morgan to his office in 1919 to discuss building what he modestly called a little something on his hilltop property, neither could have imagined that their collaboration would stretch across nearly 3 decades and consume millions of dollars, yet never reach a true conclusion. The story of Hearst Castle's construction is not simply the tale of erecting buildings on a remote California mountaintop, but rather an epic saga of ambition constantly outpacing completion, of dreams perpetually expanding, and of one man's refusal to accept that his vision could ever be finished. The construction that began in 1919 would continue with various interruptions until 1947, and even then it would stop not because the work was done, but because circumstances finally forced the aging newspaper magnate to abandon his hilltop paradise. The challenges began immediately and never truly ceased. The building site itself presented obstacles that would have discouraged less determined individuals. La Cuesta Encantada, as the hill was romantically named, rose 1,600 feet above sea level, accessible only by a primitive road that wound 5 miles up from the coast highway. Every single item needed for construction had to be transported up this treacherous path. In the early years, before the road was properly improved, vehicles frequently broke down or slid off the narrow track. Cement mixers, steel beams, marble columns, terracotta tiles, wooden timbers, plumbing fixtures, electrical wiring, and thousands of other materials all made that difficult ascent. When Hearst began importing entire rooms from European buildings, including carved ceilings from Italian monasteries and choir stalls from Spanish churches, the logistics became even more complex. The remoteness of the location created constant difficulties with the workforce. Skilled craftsmen had to be recruited from San Francisco, Los Angeles, and sometimes from as far away as Europe. These workers needed housing, food, water, and eventually electricity and other amenities. Julia Morgan designed and oversaw the construction of worker dormitories, mess halls, and workshops on the property. At the height of construction, the hilltop resembled a small town, with dozens of workers living on site, their own community existing solely to serve Hearst's vision. The turnover was high, as workers found the isolation and demanding conditions difficult to endure. Training new workers slowed progress repeatedly, and finding artisans capable of executing the intricate decorative work that Hearst demanded proved perpetually challenging. Water presented another enormous challenge. The hilltop had no natural water source adequate for the construction needs, let alone for the elaborate fountains and pools that Hearst envisioned. Morgan engineered an ingenious system of reservoirs, tanks, and pipes to capture spring water and rainwater, then pump it to where it was needed. This infrastructure itself required years to develop and constant maintenance and expansion as the castle grew. The famous Neptune Pool, a magnificent outdoor swimming pool adorned with ancient columns and sculptures, required a filtration and heating system that was extraordinarily advanced for its time. Installing such systems on a remote mountaintop demanded innovation and persistence. But the physical challenges, daunting as they were, pale in comparison to the fundamental reason the construction stretched across 28 years. William Randolph Hearst himself. The newspaper magnate was incapable of considering his creation finished. His mind constantly generated new ideas, new desires, new visions of what the castle could become. No sooner would workers complete a room than Hearst would decide it needed to be redesigned, enlarged, or redecorated. He would see a new antiquity in a dealer's catalog and immediately plan an addition to house it. He would return from a trip to Europe with fresh inspiration and order entire sections of the castle redesigned to incorporate what he had seen. Julia Morgan worked with extraordinary patience and skill to accommodate these constant changes, but each revision meant demolishing completed work, redesigning structures, and starting again. Hearst's collecting obsession fueled the endless construction. He purchased art and antiquities at an astonishing rate, acquiring entire shiploads of European architectural elements, statuary, furniture, tapestries, paintings, and decorative objects. His agents scoured the world for treasures, and Hearst bought with abandon, often without having specific plans for displaying what he acquired. Warehouses in San Francisco and New York bulged with crated items waiting to be transported to the hilltop. As these collections grew, Hearst would envision new wings, new buildings, new rooms to house them. The castle expanded organically, driven not by a master plan executed to completion, but by the ever-growing accumulation of beautiful things demanding a beautiful setting. Financial constraints also shaped the construction timeline. Although Hearst was enormously wealthy at the project's beginning, his fortune fluctuated with his business ventures. The Great Depression hit his newspaper empire hard, and by the mid-1930s, Hearst faced serious financial difficulties. Construction slowed dramatically during these years, with only essential maintenance work continuing. Workers were laid off, materials went unpurchased, and Morgan's elaborate plans remained on paper. When Hearst's finances improved, construction would resume, but these interruptions meant that momentum was constantly lost, and the project never achieved the sustained progress that might have brought it to completion. The Second World War brought another lengthy interruption. Materials became scarce as American industry focused on war production. Skilled workers left for military service or defense jobs. Hearst, now in his late 70s, spent less time at the castle, preferring his properties in Southern California. Construction slowed to a crawl, with only minor projects undertaken. The grand schemes that had driven the work forward for decades gave way to a holding pattern, with the focus shifting to maintaining what existed rather than expanding further. Throughout all these years, Julia Morgan remained Hearst's architect, designing and redesigning, supervising, and problem-solving. She made countless trips up that mountain road, spending weeks at a time on site, sleeping in simple quarters while overseeing the creation of palatial spaces. Her letters to Hearst, preserved in archives, reveal the patient diplomacy required to work with a client whose vision never stabilized. She would gently suggest that perhaps a project should be completed before starting another, that perhaps the budget should be respected, that perhaps certain changes were impractical. Hearst would often agree in principle, then immediately propose 3 new projects more ambitious than the ones being set aside. The castle grew in fits and starts, with different buildings and areas reaching various stages of completion. The main building, La Casa Grande, achieved a kind of finished state in its public rooms, though Hearst continued tinkering with details. The guest houses were completed and used extensively. The gardens matured, the pools sparkled, the zoo thrived with exotic animals, but there were always unfinished wings, incomplete decorative schemes, rooms filled with crated antiquities still waiting to be unpacked and installed. Hearst had plans for additional buildings, more elaborate gardens, expanded facilities. Blueprints and sketches existed for projects that would never be undertaken. By 1947, William Randolph Hearst was 84 years old and in declining health. His doctors insisted he leave the castle permanently for a lower elevation and easier access to medical care. He departed his hilltop dream that may, and though he hoped to return, he never would. Construction stopped almost immediately. Without Hearst's driving vision and constant stream of new ideas, there was no reason to continue. The castle stood as it was, a magnificent but incomplete monument to one man's boundless imagination and refusal to accept limits. It remains so today, forever unfinished, forever a work in progress, exactly as its creator's restless spirit demanded. Ancient Roman influence, the inspiration drawn from ancient Rome and European classical architecture. William Randolph Hearst's fascination with ancient Rome began in his youth and deepened with every journey he made across the Atlantic to explore the ruins, museums, and architectural treasures of Europe and the Mediterranean world. Unlike many wealthy Americans of his era who were content to build exact replicas of French chateaux or English manor houses, Hearst dreamed of something more ambitious and more personal, a synthesis of all the classical beauty he had witnessed in his extensive travels, reimagined and reborn on a California hilltop. The result would be a castle that drew its soul from ancient Rome while incorporating elements from Spanish Renaissance palaces, Italian villas, Greek temples, and Moorish fortresses, all harmonized into a uniquely American creation that both honored and transcended its sources of inspiration. Hearst's education in classical architecture began with his mother, Phoebe Apperson Hearst, a woman of considerable culture and refinement who believed in exposing her only child to the finest achievements of human civilization. She took young William on his first grand tour of Europe when he was just 10 years old, and the experience transformed him. In Rome, the boy walked through the Forum Romanum, touching columns that had stood for 2 millennia, imagining the senators and emperors who had passed beneath those ancient porticos. He visited the Pantheon, marveling at the perfect proportions of its dome and the way light streamed through the oculus to illuminate the marble interior. He explored the ruins of Pompeii and Herculaneum, those cities frozen in time by Vesuvius, where he could see exactly how wealthy Romans had lived, the layout of their villas, the frescoes that decorated their walls, the mosaics that adorned their floors, and the fountains that cooled their courtyards. These early impressions never left him, and as Hearst grew into adulthood and began accumulating the fortune that would fund his architectural dreams, he returned to Europe again and again, each time studying the classical heritage with greater sophistication and purpose. He understood that Roman architecture was not simply about grandeur, but about fundamental principles of design, symmetry and proportion, the relationship between interior and exterior spaces, The integration of water features and gardens with buildings, and the use of colonnades and porticos to create transitions between enclosed and open areas. These principles, perfected by Roman architects and engineers, had influenced Western architecture for 2,000 years, and Hearst wanted them to form the foundation of his hilltop palace. The basic layout of Hearst Castle reflects the Roman villa concept, particularly the arrangement of buildings around courtyards and terraces. Just as wealthy Romans built their country estates with a main residence surrounded by smaller structures connected by gardens and walkways, Hearst conceived his castle as a central building, La Casa Grande, flanked by 3 substantial guest houses positioned to create enclosed outdoor spaces. This arrangement was distinctly Roman in spirit, designed to blur the boundaries between architecture and landscape, between indoor living and outdoor enjoyment. The mild California climate, so similar to the Mediterranean, made this approach particularly appropriate, allowing for the same kind of indoor-outdoor lifestyle that Romans had perfected centuries earlier. The main building itself rises like a cathedral, its twin bell towers inspired by the Spanish church of Santa Maria la Mayor in Ronda. But the overall composition and many details draw directly from Roman precedents. The use of concrete as the primary structural material was both modern and ancient. The Romans had been masters of concrete construction, using it to build the Pantheon's unprecedented dome and the massive vaults of their basilicas and baths. Hearst and Julia Morgan used reinforced concrete to create the castle's framework, then clad it in materials that evoked antiquity: warm-toned stone, antique tiles, and terracotta ornaments that gave the building a timeless quality. Roman influence pervades the decorative program throughout the castle. The Neptune Pool, perhaps the most photographically famous feature of the entire estate, is a direct homage to Roman bathing culture. Ancient Romans elevated bathing to an art form, creating elaborate public baths and private pools adorned with marble, mosaics, and sculpture. Hearst's Neptune Pool, completed in 1936 after years of construction and reconstruction, stretches over 100 feet in length and incorporates genuine ancient Roman columns that Hearst purchased from a dismantled temple. These columns, which stood in Italy for nearly 2 millennia, now support a colonnade overlooking a pool in California, creating a vista that Romans would have recognized and appreciated. The surrounding marble deck, the classical statuary, and the temple facade at one end all speak to Roman sensibilities about how water, architecture, and sculpture should interact. Inside the castle, Roman influence appears in countless details. The assembly room, the largest and most formal space in La Casa Grande, features a coffered ceiling inspired by Roman architectural techniques, where recessed panels create visual interest and reduce the weight of the structure. The floors throughout the castle often incorporate Roman mosaic patterns or use marble in ways that recall ancient Roman interiors. Hearst collected genuine Roman antiquities, statuary, sarcophagi, architectural fragments, and decorative objects, and displayed them throughout the buildings, allowing ancient artifacts to inform and enhance the overall classical atmosphere. But Hearst did not limit himself to pure Roman sources. He understood that the classical tradition had evolved and flourished in different forms throughout European history. The Spanish Renaissance, which combined Roman classical principles with Moorish decorative exuberance, particularly captivated him. He admired how Spanish architects had taken classical symmetry and proportion and enriched them with intricate tilework, carved wooden ceilings, and ornate ironwork. Many of the castle's most striking features reflect this Spanish interpretation of classical design. The extraordinary hand-painted tiles that adorn the indoor Roman pool come from Tunisia, but reflect the same tradition of decorative brilliance that Spanish buildings had inherited from Islamic architecture, itself influenced by Roman and Byzantine precedents. Italian Renaissance architecture provided another vital source of inspiration. Hearst collected entire rooms from Italian palaces and monasteries, including carved wooden ceilings, stone fireplaces, and door surrounds that were carefully removed from their original settings, transported to California and installed in the castle. These elements, created during the Renaissance when European architects were consciously reviving and reinterpreting Roman classical design, brought authentic Renaissance craftsmanship to the hilltop while maintaining the classical thread that united all the castle's diverse elements. The gardens surrounding the castle represent perhaps the most successful synthesis of Roman and classical European influences. Ancient Romans had developed sophisticated garden design, creating terraced landscapes with fountains, statuary, and carefully planned plantings. Italian Renaissance gardens had revived and elaborated these Roman principles, creating formal layouts with geometric patterns, water features, and stone ornaments. Hearst's gardens, designed by Morgan with input from landscape architect Isabella Warne, follow this classical tradition while adapting it to the California landscape. Terraces descend the hillside, connected by stone stairways. Fountains splash in formal pools. Classical statuary stands among carefully pruned trees and flowering plants. The overall effect evokes the great gardens of Roman villas and Italian Renaissance estates, while remaining distinctly Californian in its use of native and Mediterranean plants suited to the climate. What makes Hearst Castle remarkable is not slavish imitation of ancient Roman design, but rather intelligent adaptation of classical principles to create something new. Hearst and Morgan understood that Roman architecture succeeded because it embodied timeless ideas about proportion, symmetry, the relationship between buildings and landscape, and the integration of beauty with function. By applying these principles, rather than simply copying Roman forms, they created an estate that honors its classical heritage while remaining unmistakably a product of 20th-century American ambition and creativity. The result stands as testimony to the enduring power of Roman architectural genius, the mystery of 165 rooms. Why the castle had so many rooms and how they were actually used, the number itself seems almost absurd when spoken aloud. 165 rooms sprawling across a California hilltop. A palace so vast that even its owner could not claim to have slept in every bedroom or dined in every room equipped with a table. William Randolph Hearst's castle stands as one of the most extravagant private residences ever constructed in America, and the sheer quantity of its rooms raises immediate questions in the minds of those who learn of it. Why would one man, even a man of Hearst's enormous wealth and outsized personality, need so many rooms? What purpose could they possibly serve? The answers reveal much about Hearst's character, his lifestyle, his obsessions, and the unique role that the castle played in his life as a retreat, a showplace, a museum, and a stage for entertaining the most famous and powerful people of his era. To understand the proliferation of rooms, one must first grasp that Hearst never conceived of his castle as merely a private residence, in the conventional sense. From the beginning, he envisioned it as a destination, a place where he would host extended house parties that might last for days or even weeks, with dozens of guests in residence simultaneously. Unlike a typical family home designed for a small number of occupants, the castle needed to accommodate what amounted to a small hotel's worth of visitors, each expecting their own private quarters, their own bathrooms, and access to various communal spaces for dining, entertainment, and relaxation. The three guest houses alone, Casa del Mar, Casa del Monte, and Casa del Sol, contained 38 rooms among them, each guest house designed as a self-contained residence with multiple bedroom suites, sitting rooms, and bathrooms. The main building, La Casa Grande, housed the remaining 127 rooms, a labyrinth of spaces serving every conceivable function, and many that seemed to have had no function beyond satisfying Hearst's desire to create beauty and house his collections. There were bedrooms, certainly, including Hearst's own suite and quarters for his companion Marion Davies, along with additional guest rooms for the most favored visitors. But there were also sitting rooms, libraries, billiard rooms, a theater, multiple dining rooms of different sizes, breakfast rooms, studies, offices, pantries, kitchens, storage rooms, servant quarters, wine cellars, and an astonishing number of bathrooms, some large enough to qualify as rooms in their own right, adorned with imported tiles, marble fixtures, and artistic details that rivaled the grandest public spaces. The explanation for this abundance lies partly in Hearst's hospitality and his genuine love of company. Despite his reputation as a ruthless newspaper publisher and media mogul, Hearst was in private life a gracious and generous host who delighted in gathering interesting people around him. His regular weekend house parties became legendary in Hollywood and political circles during the 1920s and 30s. Guests would receive invitations to spend several days at the castle, arriving via Hearst's private train car or by automobile for the long drive up the coast and then the winding ascent to the hilltop. Upon arrival, they would be assigned rooms in one of the guest houses or in La Casa Grande itself, with room assignments carefully orchestrated to place compatible guests near one another and to ensure that the most important visitors received the most impressive accommodations. A typical weekend might see 30 or 40 guests in residence, drawn from the worlds of entertainment, politics, journalism, business, and the arts. Movie stars mingled with senators, famous writers conversed with European nobility, directors discussed their latest projects with industrialists. This constant flow of visitors required not just bedrooms but also the supporting infrastructure of a grand hotel, multiple dining spaces to accommodate different meal configurations, sitting rooms where smaller groups could gather for conversation, game rooms for entertainment, and private spaces where guests could retreat when they desired solitude. The castle had to function simultaneously as a social hub and a collection of private refuges, and this dual purpose demanded a multiplicity of rooms. But guest accommodation, extensive as it was, explains only part of the room count. Hearst was, above all else, a collector, and his acquisitions drove much of the castle's growth and room proliferation. He purchased art and antiquities with a voraciousness that astonished even the dealers who supplied him. Entire shiploads of European architectural elements, furniture, tapestries, paintings, sculptures, and decorative objects arrived regularly at San Simeon. Each new acquisition demanded display space, and Hearst's solution was simply to create more rooms. Some rooms seemed to have been designed primarily as settings for specific collections. A room to showcase a particular set of tapestries, another to display Renaissance furniture, yet another to house his collection of ancient Greek vases. The castle also required extensive service areas that most visitors never saw, but that were essential to its operation. The kitchens were substantial, equipped to prepare meals for dozens of people multiple times daily. There were pantries for storing provisions, wine cellars for Hearst's extensive collection of wines and spirits, laundry facilities to handle the constant washing required by so many guests, and the household linens, and workshops where craftsmen could perform ongoing maintenance and repairs. Staff quarters housed the small army of servants, cooks, gardeners, and maintenance workers who kept the castle functioning: maids, butlers, chauffeurs, telephone operators, and dozens of others whose labor remained largely invisible to guests, but whose presence was essential. Hearst's own habits and preferences also contributed to the room count. He was a man who worked constantly, even while supposedly on vacation at his castle retreat. He maintained offices and workrooms where he could continue managing his vast publishing empire, communicating by telephone and telegraph with his newspapers and magazines across the country. He needed libraries to house his book collections and provide quiet spaces for reading and research. He wanted projection rooms where he could screen movies, both Hollywood productions and newsreels from his own film companies. Each of these activities required dedicated spaces, and Hearst, never one for half measures, created rooms that were fully developed and elaborately decorated rather than simple functional spaces. Many rooms served purposes that changed over time as Hearst's interests evolved and his collections grew. A room initially designed as a sitting room might be converted to a gallery for displaying newly acquired paintings. A bedroom might be repurposed as a storage room for crated antiquities awaiting proper installation. The castle was never static but constantly evolving, with Julia Morgan perpetually redesigning and reconfiguring spaces to accommodate Hearst's latest vision. This fluidity meant that rooms multiplied as new needs arose, and old rooms were subdivided or combined to create new configurations. The bathrooms deserve special mention, as their number and magnificence exceeded anything found in even the grandest contemporary residences. Hearst believed that bathrooms should be as beautiful and comfortable as any other room in the house, and he spared no expense in creating bathing chambers that rivaled Roman baths in their luxury. Many featured imported tiles from Tunisia, Spain, and Italy, custom-designed fixtures, elaborate lighting, and artistic details that transformed utilitarian spaces into works of art. Some bathrooms were large enough to include sitting areas, dressing rooms, and multiple fixtures, functioning more as private spas than mere bathrooms. Yet, despite having 165 rooms at his disposal, Hearst actually used relatively few of them regularly. He had his favorite spaces, his private suite, his Gothic study where he worked, the assembly room where guests gathered before dinner, the refectory where meals were served at a long monastic table. Many rooms remained largely unoccupied, perfect and waiting, like stage sets prepared for a performance that might or might not occur. In the end, the mystery of the 165 rooms is no mystery at all. They existed because Hearst could build them, because his vision demanded them, and because for him, enough was never truly enough. Hollywood's golden parties, when movie stars, celebrities, and politicians gathered for lavish parties. During the golden age of Hollywood, between the 1920s and early 1940s, there existed a place where the most famous faces in America gathered, where political power brokers rubbed shoulders with silver screen idols, where champagne flowed freely and laughter echoed across Mediterranean terraces under California stars. This was Hearst Castle at its zenith. When William Randolph Hearst reigned as one of the most powerful men in America, and his hilltop palace served as the ultimate destination for anyone who mattered in entertainment, politics, journalism, or high society. The weekend parties that Hearst hosted became legendary, whispered about in Hollywood studios and New York penthouses, coveted invitations that could make or break careers, magical interludes where the rich and famous played like children in a fantasy land created by a newspaper emperor who loved nothing more than surrounding himself with interesting, beautiful, and influential people. An invitation to San Simeon, as Hearst's estate was known, arrived like a royal summons, typically delivered by telephone from one of Hearst's secretaries. The invitations were rarely declined, for a weekend at the castle represented the pinnacle of social achievement in that era. Guests understood that they were being admitted to an exclusive club, that their presence had been specifically desired by Hearst himself, and that the experience awaiting them would be unlike anything else in their lives. The guest lists read like a catalog of 20th century fame. Charlie Chaplin arrived regularly, his genius for comedy much admired by Hearst. Clark Gable came with Carole Lombard, the golden couple of Hollywood enjoying the castle's pleasures. Greta Garbo, notoriously reclusive, made rare appearances drawn by the promise of privacy within opulence. Joan Crawford, Gary Cooper, James Stewart, Cary Grant, and countless other stars made the pilgrimage up the mountain. But the parties were never exclusively Hollywood affairs, for Hearst deliberately mixed his guests to create the most interesting possible combinations. Politicians arrived fresh from Washington, governors and cabinet members, occasionally even presidents or presidential candidates who understood that Hearst's newspapers could influence millions of voters. Winston Churchill visited before becoming Britain's wartime leader, finding much to discuss with the American press lord. Literary figures like George Bernard Shaw engaged in witty repartee at the long dining table. Aviators like Charles Lindbergh, fresh from their record-breaking flights, described their adventures to rapt audiences. European nobility, artists, business tycoons, and famous journalists all received invitations, creating a cosmopolitan atmosphere where conversations sparkled with diverse perspectives and experiences. The logistics of these gatherings were orchestrated with military precision by Hearst's staff. Guests typically arrived on Friday evenings. many having traveled from Los Angeles on Hearst's private railway car or by automobile caravan up the coastal highway and then along the winding 5-mile road to the summit. Upon arrival, they were greeted by servants who directed them to their assigned accommodations in one of the 3 guest houses, or in rooms within La Casa Grande itself. Room assignments were strategic, with Hearst carefully considering which guests should be near each other and ensuring that the most important visitors received the most spectacular quarters. Fresh flowers adorned every room. Finest linens dressed the beds, and bathrooms stocked with luxurious toiletries awaited the weary travelers. The weekend routine followed patterns that Hearst had established and that guests quickly learned. Breakfast was informal, with food laid out buffet style and guests appearing whenever they awakened. Some rising early to ride horses through the ranch lands, others sleeping late after the previous night's festivities. Hearst himself often worked during the mornings, managing his publishing empire via telephone and telegraph, while guests explored the grounds, lounged by the pools, or visited the zoo to see exotic animals ranging from zebras to bears, from elephants to rare birds. Lunch might be served outdoors on a terrace or in one of the smaller dining rooms, a casual affair where guests could come and go as they pleased. Afternoons belonged to recreation and leisure. The Neptune Pool, that magnificent marble basin surrounded by colonnades and classical statuary, became the center of activity on warm days. Movie stars who normally appeared before cameras in careful makeup and lighting now splashed and played like ordinary people, though photographs from these pool parties reveal that even in casual settings, the glamour remained. Tennis courts offered opportunities for competitive matches, with Hearst himself occasionally participating despite his advancing years. Horseback riding parties ventured into the surrounding hills, picnicking at scenic overlooks. The indoor Roman pool, an extraordinary space lined with blue and gold tiles that created an underwater cathedral effect, provided a more intimate bathing option, its jewel-like beauty inspiring awe in every first-time visitor. As evening approached, expectations heightened, for dinner at Hearst Castle was always the day's main event. Guests were expected to gather in the assembly room, that vast space adorned with choir stalls, Renaissance paintings, and antique tapestries, where cocktails were served and conversation flowed. Hearst enforced certain rules that surprised some guests accustomed to wilder Hollywood parties. Excessive drinking was discouraged, and anyone who became noticeably intoxicated might not receive another invitation. The dress code, while elegant, was not overly formal. Hearst preferred comfortable sophistication to stuffy ceremony. Marion Davies, Hearst's beloved companion and a successful actress in her own right, served as hostess, her warmth and humor helping to put guests at ease. Dinner was served in the refectory, a magnificent hall where guests sat at a long table beneath banners and Gothic tapestries. Surrounded by centuries-old choir stalls and religious artifacts that Hearst had collected from European monasteries. Despite the medieval grandeur of the setting, the atmosphere was relaxed and jovial. Hearst sat in the middle of the table rather than at its head, the better to participate in conversations flowing in both directions. The food was surprisingly simple for such an opulent setting. Hearst preferred hearty American fare to elaborate French cuisine. Marion Davies often led the conversation, her quick wit and gift for mimicry keeping everyone entertained. Stories were told, Jokes were shared, and the diverse guests discovered unexpected common ground. After dinner, the party typically moved to the theater, where Hearst screened the latest Hollywood productions, often films that had not yet been released to the public. For movie stars, watching their own performances or those of their colleagues in such a setting created a unique experience, combining professional interest with social pleasure. Hearst loved movies and attended carefully, occasionally offering comments that revealed his shrewd understanding of what appealed to audiences. Following the screening, guests might return to the assembly room for more conversation, or they might drift off in smaller groups to play billiards, explore the castle's treasures, or simply stand on the terraces gazing out at the Pacific Ocean gleaming in the moonlight. The parties continued through Saturday and into Sunday, with variations on the established routines. Sunday evenings typically saw departures, with guests reluctantly leaving their hilltop paradise to return to their regular lives in Los Angeles, New York, or Washington. They left with memories of an enchanted interlude, of days spent in extraordinary beauty surrounded by fascinating people, of a lifestyle that seemed almost impossibly glamorous even to those who were themselves famous and wealthy. For William Randolph Hearst, these gatherings represented his greatest pleasure, the fulfillment of his vision that his castle should be not merely a monument to beauty, but a living space where culture, power, and celebrity intersected in magical combinations that could exist nowhere else on earth. Power, media, and wealth. Hearst's influence as a media tycoon and how power shaped the castle. William Randolph Hearst did not build his castle with inherited wealth alone, nor did it spring from passive investments or cautious business ventures. The palace on the California hilltop was constructed with a fortune earned through the aggressive, relentless, and often ruthless pursuit of media dominance in an age when newspapers were the primary source of information for millions of Americans. Hearst's castle stands as a physical monument to the extraordinary power that one man could accumulate through control of the printed word. A testament to an era when media barons wielded influence that rivaled elected officials and could shape public opinion, start wars, make and break political careers, and amass wealth on a scale that transformed them into American royalty. To understand the castle, one must understand the empire that funded it and the complex, contradictory man who built both. Hearst's journey to media dominance began in 1887, when his father, mining magnate George Hearst, reluctantly allowed his 23-year-old son to take control of the San Francisco Examiner, a struggling newspaper that the elder Hearst had acquired to support his political ambitions. Young William had been expelled from Harvard for irresponsible pranks, but had developed a passionate interest in journalism, studying the techniques of Joseph Pulitzer's sensationalistic New York World. Given his chance with the Examiner, Hearst transformed it with shocking speed, employing tactics that would define his career: screaming headlines, lurid crime stories, aggressive investigative reporting, lavish illustrations, and a willingness to blur the line between news and entertainment. He hired the best writers and artists he could find, paying top salaries that his competitors could not match. And he spent his father's money freely to make the Examiner the most talked-about newspaper in San Francisco. The success in San Francisco was merely the beginning. In 1895, Hearst invaded New York, purchasing the struggling New York Journal and immediately declaring war on Pulitzer's World. The circulation battle that followed became legendary in journalism history. A conflict so intense and unscrupulous that it gave birth to the term yellow journalism, named for the Yellow Kid comic strip that both papers fought to control. Hearst and Pulitzer engaged in an escalating competition of sensationalism, each trying to outdo the other with more shocking headlines, more dramatic illustrations, more scandalous stories. Hearst raided Pulitzer's staff, offering salaries that doubled or tripled what the world paid, bringing entire departments of writers, editors, and artists to the journal. He slashed his newspaper's price to undercut the world, absorbing massive losses to build circulation. The methods Hearst employed were often questionable, sometimes indefensible. His newspapers exaggerated stories, invented quotes, published rumors as facts, and whipped up public emotions with little regard for truth or consequences. When the battleship Maine exploded in Havana Harbor in 1898, Hearst's papers immediately blamed Spain, screaming for war with headlines that inflamed public opinion despite lacking evidence of Spanish involvement. Whether Hearst's jingoistic coverage actually caused the Spanish-American War remains debatable among historians. But there is no doubt that his newspapers helped create the atmosphere that made war inevitable. Legend claims that when artist Frederick Remington sent to Cuba to illustrate the conflict, telegraphed Hearst that there was no war to illustrate. Hearst replied, "You furnish the pictures, and I'll furnish the war." Whether the exchange actually occurred matters less than the fact that it perfectly captured how many Americans viewed Hearst's role in pushing the nation. Toward conflict, the war made Hearst even wealthier and more powerful. His newspaper's circulation soared as Americans devoured coverage of the brief conflict. Hearst himself traveled to Cuba, inserting himself into the story, even participating in the capture of Spanish soldiers, and then writing about his own heroic exploits in his newspapers. It was pure theater, self-promotion masquerading as journalism, but it sold papers by the millions. With his profits, Hearst expanded his empire, purchasing newspapers in Chicago, Boston, Los Angeles, and other major cities, building a national chain that gave him unprecedented reach and influence. By the time he began constructing his castle in 1919, Hearst controlled more than 24 newspapers reaching millions of readers daily, along with magazines, newsreel companies, and wire services. His media empire generated enormous revenues, and Hearst spent with a lavishness that seemed designed to prove that no amount was too much. The castle became the ultimate expression of this spending, a project where cost was essentially irrelevant, where Hearst could indulge every whim without regard to budgets or practical limitations. When he wanted genuine Roman columns for his Neptune Pool, he simply purchased them from dismantled European buildings. When he saw a beautiful ceiling in a Spanish monastery, he bought the entire ceiling and had it shipped to California. His art collecting reached pathological levels, with warehouses full of acquisitions that he sometimes forgot he owned. The castle itself became an instrument of Hearst's power, a stage where he could demonstrate his wealth and influence to anyone who mattered in American life. The weekend parties were not merely social gatherings, but exercises in power brokering, where movie stars met politicians, where deals were discussed over cocktails, where careers could be advanced or destroyed by a word from the host. Hearst used his invitations strategically, rewarding those who pleased him with coveted weekends at San Simeon, withholding invitations from those who fell from favor. The castle functioned as a court, with Hearst as the monarch, dispensing hospitality and opportunity to his chosen favorites. His newspapers gave Hearst direct political power that he wielded without hesitation or subtlety. He served 2 terms in Congress himself, elected from New York, and seriously pursued the presidency, though his ambitions in elected office never matched his success in business. But even without holding high office, Hearst could make or break political careers through his newspaper's coverage. Politicians courted his favor, hoping for positive coverage in his papers, fearing the destructive power of his editorial opposition. Presidents invited him to the White House, seeking his support or trying to neutralize his hostility. His newspapers championed causes that Hearst personally favored. From populist economic policies to isolationism in foreign affairs, and millions of readers absorbed his views along with their morning coffee. Yet the power that built the castle also shaped it in darker ways. The extravagance that Hearst displayed stood in stark contrast to the struggles of ordinary Americans, particularly during the Great Depression when his empire faced financial crisis. Hearst had always spent more than he earned, borrowing against future revenues to fund his acquisitions and his castle's endless construction. When the Depression devastated advertising revenues and circulation, when his business managers finally forced him to confront his financial reality, Hearst discovered that even his vast wealth had limits. In the late 1930s, he was forced to sell off parts of his art collection, liquidate some of his properties, and accept oversight from bankers who insisted on financial discipline. The castle's construction slowed dramatically during these years, a visible symbol of diminished power. The relationship between Hearst's media empire and his castle was symbiotic and complex. The newspapers funded the castle's construction, but the castle also served the newspaper's interests, providing a glamorous setting that attracted the famous and powerful, giving Hearst access to newsmakers and influencers, creating an aura of importance and success that enhanced his publication's prestige. Photographs of celebrities at San Simeon appeared in his newspapers and magazines, generating publicity that benefited both his social position and his business interests. The castle was simultaneously a private retreat and a public statement, a home and a monument, a place of genuine beauty and a calculated demonstration of power. In the end, Hearst's castle stands as a permanent reminder of an era when media power could be concentrated in individual hands, when one man's newspapers could reach into millions of homes, shaping opinions and influencing events on a scale difficult to imagine in today's fragmented media landscape. The beginning of the fall, the Great Depression, financial struggles, and unfinished ambitions. The stock market crash of October 1929 sent shock waves through American society, toppling fortunes, destroying businesses, and plunging the nation into the worst economic crisis it had ever faced. For most Americans, the Great Depression meant unemployment, hunger, and desperation. For William Randolph Hearst, the most powerful media mogul in the country, it meant something he had never truly experienced in his 7 decades of life: limits. The man who had spent without restraint for 40 years, who had built a castle on a California hilltop without regard to cost, who had accumulated art and antiquities with the fervor of an addict, suddenly confronted the uncomfortable reality that even his vast fortune was not infinite. The Depression did not destroy Hearst immediately, but it began a slow, inexorable process that would ultimately force him to abandon his beloved castle and watch helplessly as the empire he had built crumbled around him. The beginning of the fall was gradual, almost invisible at first, but once it started, nothing could stop it. In the first years after the crash, Hearst seemed almost immune to the catastrophe engulfing the nation. His newspapers continued publishing, his castle construction proceeded, and his lifestyle remained as extravagant as ever. He had weathered financial difficulties before, and his supreme confidence in his own abilities convinced him that this crisis, like others, would pass without seriously affecting him. But Hearst failed to grasp how fundamentally the Depression was changing America. As unemployment soared past 25%, as banks failed by the thousands, as factories closed and farms were foreclosed, Americans had less money to spend on newspapers and magazines. Advertising revenues, the lifeblood of Hearst's publishing empire, began to decline sharply as businesses cut their marketing budgets or disappeared. Hearst's response to declining revenues was to spend more, not less. He believed that aggressive expansion and high-quality content would allow his publications to capture market share from weaker competitors. He continued acquiring newspapers, magazines, and radio stations throughout the early Depression years, borrowing heavily to finance these purchases. At the same time, he refused to curtail his personal spending. The castle construction continued with barely a pause, consuming hundreds of thousands of dollars annually. His art collecting accelerated rather than slowed as the Depression created a buyer's market for antiquities and artworks. European dealers, desperate for cash as their own economies collapsed, offered treasures at reduced prices, and Hearst bought compulsively, unable to resist what seemed like bargains even as his accountants warned that his expenditures far exceeded his income. The fundamental problem was that Hearst had always operated on borrowed money, using his assets as collateral for loans that he rolled over year after year, confident that future revenues would cover current debts. This strategy worked brilliantly during prosperous times when revenues grew and lenders eagerly extended credit to a man who controlled a media empire worth hundreds of millions of dollars. But the Depression changed everything. As revenues declined year after year through the early 1930s, as losses mounted and debts accumulated, lenders grew nervous. They began demanding repayment rather than extending new credit. Hearst discovered that the castle, his art collections, his newspapers, and his real estate holdings were worth far less than he had assumed. During the Depression, finding buyers for luxury goods proved nearly impossible, and even if buyers existed, they could offer only a fraction of what Hearst had paid during prosperous times. By 1935, Hearst's financial situation had become critical. He owed approximately $125 million to various creditors, an astronomical sum equivalent to billions in modern currency. His annual income had fallen to a fraction of its pre-Depression peak, yet his expenses remained enormous. The interest alone on his debts consumed most of his revenues, leaving little for operations. Nothing for debt reduction, and certainly nothing for the continued extravagances that Hearst considered essential to his lifestyle. His business managers, led by financial expert Clarence Shern, finally confronted him with the brutal truth. He was facing bankruptcy unless he took immediate, drastic action. For Hearst, a man accustomed to absolute control over his empire, the confrontation was devastating. He raged against the advice, refused to believe the numbers, and insisted that his financial difficulties were temporary problems that would resolve themselves. But the numbers were irrefutable, and Hearst's creditors were losing patience. In 1937, they forced a crisis. A consortium of banks and insurance companies that held most of Hearst's debt demanded either full repayment or they would force him into bankruptcy and liquidate his assets. Faced with this ultimatum, Hearst had no choice but to surrender control of his empire. He signed agreements that placed his newspapers, magazines, and other properties under the management of a conservation committee that would operate them to generate cash to pay down debts. More painfully, he agreed to stop acquiring art and to begin selling his collections. The man who had spent decades accumulating treasures now watched helplessly as auctioneers sold off paintings, sculptures, tapestries, furniture, and architectural elements that he had lovingly collected. The sales were conducted with brutal efficiency. Gimbel's department store in New York held a massive auction of Hearst's excess inventory in 1938 and 1939, offering thousands of items to the public at prices that represented a tiny fraction of what Hearst had paid. Medieval armor, Renaissance paintings, antique furniture, ancient Greek and Roman artifacts all went under the hammer. Hearst was forbidden from attending the sales, spared at least the agony of watching his treasures dispersed, but he read the reports and suffered deeply. Each item sold represented not just financial loss, but the destruction of dreams, the dismantling of the comprehensive collection he had envisioned housing in his castle, and eventually bequeathing to the American people as a great museum. Construction at the castle stopped almost entirely during these years. The small army of craftsmen and workers who had labored the hilltop for nearly 2 decades were dismissed. Julia Morgan, the architect who had devoted so much of her career to realizing Hearst's vision, found herself with little to do. The grand plans for additional buildings, expanded gardens, and new wings that Hearst had sketched remained on paper, forever unrealized. Rooms stood unfinished, crates of unpacked antiquities filled storage areas, and the castle assumed the incomplete, frozen-in-time quality that it retains to this day. Maintenance continued, for the buildings could not be allowed to deteriorate, but the era of constant creation and expansion had ended. Hearst himself remained at the castle when possible, but his visits grew shorter and less frequent. The financial crisis had aged him visibly. The supreme confidence that had characterized his entire life had been shaken by the realization that even William Randolph Hearst could not bend economic reality to his will. He continued managing what remained of his empire, working to restore it to profitability, so that perhaps someday he could resume his former lifestyle. Hearst Castle today, from private palace to historic landmark and public monument, on a spring morning in 1947, William Randolph Hearst descended from his hilltop castle for the final time, leaving behind the palace that had consumed his fortune, his passion, and nearly 3 decades of his life. His doctors had insisted that his failing health required him to relocate to lower elevation with easier access to medical care, and so, at 84 years old, Hearst departed the dream he had built, never to return. He died 4 years later in 1951, and with his passing came the question of what would become of the extraordinary estate he had created. The castle stood incomplete, filled with priceless art and antiquities, perched on its remote hilltop like a monument from another age, a relic of vanished extravagance in a nation that had emerged from depression and world war with different values and priorities. The transformation of Hearst Castle from private palace to public monument is a story of family decisions, state intervention, preservation challenges, and the gradual recognition that what had been built as one man's fantasy retreat had become something far more significant, a cultural treasure belonging to all Americans. The Hearst family faced an immediate dilemma after William Randolph Hearst's death. The castle and its contents represented enormous value, but finding a buyer capable of purchasing and maintaining such a property seemed impossible. The estate was too large, too expensive to operate, too remote and too idiosyncratic to function as a hotel or resort. Selling the art collection separately would generate cash but would destroy the integrity of what Hearst had created, scattering the carefully assembled treasures that gave the castle much of its significance. The family considered various options, including maintaining the property as a private retreat for family use, but the costs were prohibitive. The annual expenses of staffing, maintaining, and operating the castle exceeded what even the wealthy Hearst heirs could justify spending on a property they rarely visited. The solution came through negotiation with the state of California. In 1957, the Hearst Corporation donated the castle, its contents, and the surrounding land to the state as a memorial to William Randolph Hearst's mother, Phoebe Apperson Hearst, who had first purchased much of the property and whose cultural philanthropy had been considerable. The donation was structured carefully, with the Hearst Corporation retaining significant landholdings around the castle while transferring the core property to state ownership. In exchange for the donation, the Hearst family received substantial tax benefits and the assurance that the castle would be preserved and open to the public rather than demolished or sold piecemeal. The state accepted the gift with the understanding that the property would become a state historical monument, maintained for public education and enjoyment. Opening the castle to public visitation presented challenges that no one had fully anticipated. The property had been designed as a private residence, with no consideration given to accommodating crowds of tourists. The access road was narrow and winding, capable of handling only limited traffic. The buildings lacked adequate restroom facilities for visitors, proper safety features like fire suppression systems and emergency exits, or the kind of barrier systems needed to protect priceless artworks and furnishings from damage by thousands of touching hands. The state invested significantly in infrastructure improvements, widening and paving the access road, constructing a visitor center at the base of the hill, installing bus systems to transport tourists to the summit, and carefully modifying the buildings to meet safety codes while preserving their historic character. The first public tours began in June 1958. And the response exceeded all expectations. Californians who had read about Hearst's legendary castle in newspapers and magazines for decades finally had the opportunity to see it for themselves. Lines formed early in the morning, with visitors willing to wait hours for the chance to tour the estate. The castle's remote location, which had seemed like a liability, proved to be part of its appeal. The 5-mile journey up the winding hillside road, with spectacular views of the Pacific Ocean and the coastal mountains, created a sense of pilgrimage and heightened anticipation. When visitors finally reached the summit and saw La Casa Grande rising above its terraces, with the Neptune Pool gleaming in the California sun, the impact was profound. Here was fantasy made real, a glimpse into a lifestyle so opulent that it seemed to belong to fiction rather than history. Managing the castle as a tourist destination required developing new expertise in historic preservation and interpretation. The state hired curators, conservators, tour guides, and maintenance specialists who understood both the historical significance of the property and the practical challenges of preserving it while allowing public access. Every tour route had to be carefully planned to protect the most fragile elements while showcasing the castle's highlights. Velvet ropes and barriers appeared, protecting furniture and artworks from accidental damage. Climate control systems were installed to prevent deterioration of tapestries, paintings, and other sensitive materials. Security measures, subtle but effective, deterred theft and vandalism. The balance between access and preservation became a constant negotiation, with policies evolving as experience revealed what worked and what threatened the property's integrity. The collections presented particular challenges. Hearst had filled his castle with genuine antiquities, some dating back thousands of years, alongside Renaissance furniture, priceless tapestries, ancient sculptures, and decorative arts from dozens of cultures and historical periods. Many items had been inadequately documented when Hearst acquired them, leaving curators to research provenance, authenticity, and historical significance. Some pieces proved to be reproductions rather than authentic antiquities, evidence of how even expert collectors could be deceived. Other items were authenticated as genuine treasures of immense scholarly value. The ongoing work of cataloging, researching, and conserving the collections continues to this day, with new discoveries still emerging as specialists study the estate's holdings. Over the decades since opening to the public, Hearst Castle has evolved from a curiosity into a major cultural institution. More than 1 million visitors tour the property annually, making it one of California's most popular tourist attractions. The castle has been designated a National Historic Landmark, recognizing its significance to American architectural and cultural history. Documentary films, books, and scholarly studies have explored every aspect of the estate, from its architectural design to the lives of the people who built it, from Hearst's collecting practices to the social history of his legendary parties. The castle has appeared in movies and television shows, cementing its place in popular culture. The interpretation of the castle has also matured and deepened. Early tours focused primarily on the glamour and extravagance, presenting the estate as a monument to wealth and celebrity. Contemporary interpretation takes a more nuanced approach, examining the complex legacy of William Randolph Hearst, acknowledging both his cultural contributions and his controversial journalism practices. Tours explore the lives of the craftsmen who built the castle, the servants who maintained it, and the architect Julia Morgan, whose brilliant work made Hearst's vision reality. The castle is presented not just as one man's achievement, but as a collaborative creation involving hundreds of workers and artists. Preservation work continues perpetually, for a property of this scale and complexity never stops requiring care. Roofs need replacing, plumbing systems require updating, foundations must be stabilized against earthquakes, and artworks need conservation. The state commits millions of dollars annually to these efforts, understanding that Hearst Castle represents an irreplaceable piece of American heritage. What began as one man's private fantasy has become a public trust, a monument that tells the story of American ambition, creativity, excess, and cultural aspiration. Visitors who climb the hill to see Hearst's dream encounter not just beautiful buildings and priceless art, but a complex historical narrative about power, wealth, artistic vision, and the transformation of private dreams into public heritage. The castle endures, incomplete as Hearst left it, a work forever in progress, now belonging to everyone and to no one, a palace that has found its purpose in being shared rather than possessed.